All right, well, hey everybody, welcome to Undisciplined by Design. This is a show where we talk about the interesting ways that creativity overlaps between disciplines and look at how the future is being designed by creative leaders. So thanks for coming and hanging out with us today. My name's Aaron. I am the host of the show, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Cincinnati. I teach classes on design thinking, innovation, and digital storytelling. And I also am lucky enough to get to have some really interesting conversations and hear what folks like our guest today, Geoff Baldwin, are doing in the world. So Geoff's an ID grad from the University of Cincinnati and has had a really interesting career arc and has learned some things along the way that we're going to talk about today. So Geoff, you want to give us a little introduction of yourself? And then I think probably kind of getting to introduce yourself also is a great segue into just maybe walk us through your story arc of where you are in the creative world now and where that journey started.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I appreciate being on the show, Aaron. This is gonna be fun. So I guess to kind of start at the beginning. I mean, yeah, I'm a graduate of the ID program at Cincinnati. I graduated in '06, but I was rejected by the School of Design like 3 times. So this whole we can get into it later. This offline stuff for people that want to know how to get into the hardest design program in the world. But I was just I pursued it very hard. So every time I was told I couldn't be in the program, I just eventually started showing up to class. Some great stories about that. But I graduated from Cincinnati in '06. Right now, I'm the founder of a small design practice in the New York City area called People, Places, and Things. We design products and services for startups, corporate teams. Sometimes we collaborate with other agencies. I can talk about that a little bit, but yeah, the in-between stuff. When I graduated from DAAP, I started at IDEO in their Chicago office, which for an industrial designer is like the coolest place to start your career. And I guess in some ways it kind of ruined me because, the premise of this conversation is about, designing across disciplines. And yeah, I don't know any other way to work. That's how it all started, for me. The very first project that I was ever put on at IDEO was this, multidisciplinary team working on designing a sustainable cosmetics brand, line of new cosmetics for Natura, which is a Brazilian cosmetics company that's kind of like Mary Kay here in the States. And so I just don't know any other way than other people of other disciplines trying on my hat and me trying on theirs, and everybody kind of stepping on each other's toes, but most of the time getting along. So I just don't know any other way to work. And so throughout my career, I found myself in other places where, there have been moments where I've been like, hey, you guys are doing this wrong. But yeah, so I was at IDEO in Chicago for 4 years. It was kind of like grad school for me. I worked on, everything from pickup trucks to dog treats, strategic projects, a lot of strategic things, positioning focused things, but it's still also working on tactical product design. But at the end of the 4 years, I kind of felt like even though I was growing in a lot of different ways, I needed to kind of deepen my craft as an industrial designer. And so circuitously, I found my way to the West Coast into a design studio called Lunar, who at the time it was I'd been working at IDEO, and working at Lunar was working at IDEO during the 90s, because it was just amazing, hardcore industrial design, mechanical engineering. I worked with some of the best mechanical engineers I've ever worked with in my life. They made me completely question my abilities as an industrial designer. But I think one of the coolest parts about working at Lunar was at IDEO, we were always working on projects and kind of finding this blue ocean. And there was always, you were using our creating a strategy to figure out where companies or brands should go. And I always felt like that strategy could be applied to the thing itself. Every line should be there for a reason. And so Lunar was a fun spot to go and work on, my craft as an industrial designer, and think about why, instead of designing concepts in a way you're throwing spaghetti at the wall, I wanted to throw darts, this can only be this way because we saw this, and this when we did research. So I was at Lunar for a few years, and then found my way back to the East Coast. Thankfully, because my wife is from the East Coast, and we just, the West Coast wasn't going to be a place that we started a family. Okay. But I'd always been obsessed with this idea of the overlap between design and advertising. And so a lot of the places that I worked at, whether it was internships at Continuum or working at IDEO or working at Lunar, they all sold themselves on their process as if it were a guarantee of success. So, and the truth is, like, there's no such thing as a guarantee of success. And, everyone's process is relatively the same. So I felt like if you could design a thing in the way you talk about it from the same point of inspiration, that would be just differentiated. And so I found my way to a little, ironically enough, like, ad agencies aren't like really asking for industrial designers to come and make products there. It's not like a thing that's on their website, but right. I found this little design studio, this digital agency called Code and Theory, and they were looking to hire a contract industrial designer. So I quit my full-time job, went in for the interview, and kind of just said, hey, I want to start an ID group at an ad agency. You're not an ad agency, but you're close enough. And by the end of the week, that's what we were doing. And we built a team, and half the time we were working on digital fit and physical projects, and half the time we were working on objects and messages. And so that was kind of what took me from being like purely an industrial designer that worked in multidisciplinary teams to someone that started to lead those multidisciplinary teams. And, from there, I worked at a couple different places. I ended up coming back to IDEO to work at .org, to work in social impact related to design. And then most recently, I kind of find myself having my own studio. I was, like so many people, my career was impacted by COVID back in March, and I was laid off and just started picking up projects. And now I have this little burgeoning pandemic design studio here in Westport, Connecticut. So
pandemic
design brings us full circle.
That's kind of a thing now. That there's a term that we never thought we would use in the industry, right?
Yeah, exactly. I've said that to a few people, and they're like, they're like, I'm going to use that. I'm like, go for it.
Well, I love the arc, and I love that, I think you're onto something with this idea of kind of it ruined you from the beginning, right? Because a lot of times we're talking to people who are, 20 years into their career and only then are starting to realize like this path that they were on that's leading them to understand more and more the value of like not just being in their craft. Like there is a value there, but like starting to realize like, wow, it's been really rich to like over the years start to like steal these tricks from people, or like the magic happens when we all get together. And you started off that way in sort of a dream job for a lot of industrial designers. And that's just seems like that's really shaped your story arc,
It has. And, I think there's two things I would touch on with that is, number one, like students now that I see coming out of lots of programs, including DAAP, it's so incredible to see the hybrid designers that are coming out. Like when I was at this place called Co-Collective after Code and Theory, and it was kind of like, it was another place, it was a bunch of titans of advertising that wanted to do more design. And so we got together and we tried to do that. And I remember, I was the head of design there. And so I was managing creative technologists. I was managing visual designers, UX designers, industrial designers, copywriters. And, and I think that to me, like I said before, like if I have a strength, it's not that I'm good at all those things. It's that I'm not afraid to try out other people's tools. And so usually I do that just to have a better conversation. Like I don't pretend to be the best UX designer in the world, but I will wireframe something and share it with other UX designers so we can have a substantive conversation about what an experience should be. Mm-hmm. But I remember when I was working there, I brought a couple students in, one from Art Center and one from Cincinnati. And I wanted to I brought them in for interviews, and I had a bunch of these graphic designers, these brand designers in these interviews, and they're like, I don't know why we need to go see this industrial designer. And I was like, these people can do your job too. And because their portfolios were amazing. Their portfolios were like great product design, really solid, interaction design, and actually very good branding. And so the hybrid designers that are coming out now are just, every time I see portfolio, it's like, wow, this person is so much further along skill-wise than I was when I was in school. Now, there's a whole mental and emotional side to it that comes with experience, but it's pretty incredible. The other thing I would say though is like, even though there's a lot of like hybridization happening, at the end of it, you're still kind of one thing. Like, I'm an industrial designer. Like, that's what I am. I work on a broad range of things right now, but I'm never going to be an expert at everything. And the other part of it is, and this is the thing I learned like the hard way, I don't care about everything. Like, you have to love the details.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you're never going to make anything. So you have to love the details. And the things that I love the details of more often than not are physical products. And doesn't mean I don't participate on other like digital, things, but I just recognize the talents and the passions of the other people around me.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to figure out ways to kind of like, serve them.
Mm-hmm. I think what you're hitting on too is it's a good example. Visually, it makes me think of that idea of like the person who's a T, kind of the T-shaped
Mm-hmm.
professional. You probably heard that term. And I think IDEO even kind of builds teams with that in mind, right? And, being able to have that appreciation and ability to have an intelligent conversation and even maybe like touch and feel the same stuff as somebody else who has a different expertise that's deep than you. And I just, visually even picture like when you put a bunch of those together and all of a sudden they form like a full circle or a really long line. It's got deep roots too. Like everybody gets to be their best selves when you do that,
Yeah. It's funny you bring up T-shape because IDEO is like the best cult ever. And I totally drank the Kool-Aid. And so, so anyone that's ever worked with, or, I've been with me before, or I've been the manager of, has heard me talk about and seen me draw T's. Like that was the thing that I would do when I was, reviewing people, is we would draw out the T-shapes. Because to me, like when you're, especially early in your career, you get hired for, you get hired for two reasons. You get hired either because of your potential or your experience. And the whole goal of being employed is to gain new potential to create new potential while you gain experience. Mm-hmm. So if you're a young person coming into an organization, your T is going to look one of two ways. It's either going to be a dotted line at the top and a thin line in the middle, where you're like, oh, this person, I know they're going to fit in on our UX team or our ID team because they have a skill, and that's going to be really beneficial to us. Or you're a straight line on the top, like a skinny line on the top and a dotted line in the middle. And this is like, I don't know what this person's going to be. Maybe they're a creative technologist. Maybe they're a UX person. Maybe they're a researcher. I don't know, but they're really freaking cool and we got to have them. And we'll figure out a way to get them in the mix and try not to mess them up. But over time, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make the line on the bottom thicker and thicker, and still make the line on top thicker and thicker, but still you need a thicker base than you have a top, or you're going to fall over. And for me, like when I left IDEO the first time, I would have to say I had a very thick top and I had a very skinny bottom. And that's why I had to go to a place like Lunar, because I was just like malnourished as an industrial designer. I had to go, learn how to be a better industrial designer and deepen my craft by getting my butt kicked by some amazing mechanical engineers.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah. Well, I draw T's for my students too. So I think we didn't meet until today, but I think we're kindred spirits here, man, because I'm doing the same thing. I'm as a result of the pandemic, I created a program back in the spring that I think is going to live past COVID now, which is really cool. But it's called the Virtual Innovation Studio. And we're doing a lot of the same stuff you're talking about, where we have, corporate partners or even nonprofits that come to us with the challenge has to be messy enough that it needs more than one discipline to solve it.
Yeah.
So we kind of screen the people who come at us with ideas to say like, no, that sounds like you should hire a co-op for that. This is for challenges that have to be messy enough to take in all these skills. And then we're building teams of anywhere from 8 to 24 students.
Wow.
And we're doing this 100% virtually, working on these in 5-week sprints. And so those teams, the students that thrive are the ones that have that. And I actually really like your dotted versus thick lines thing, because I can see that even now. These are mostly undergrads. I have a few MBA and grad students that are in here, but you can see it too. The ones that are thriving in this environment are the ones that are they're not scared of the idea of being an industrial designer and saying like, oh, this is a UX project. I need to figure out enough about that I can bring the human-centric design components of being an industrial designer and just apply them to this digital platform, right? Like those students are thriving.
Well, and I mean, to be incredibly biased right now, like I think industrial design students are the best design students because I think it's very rare that I've ever seen an interaction designer become an industrial designer or a graphic designer become an industrial designer. I've seen a lot of industrial designers quit industrial design and go do lots of other stuff.
Yeah.
And so it's a matter of just learning a new tool. You know, it's about learning Sketch or Adobe XD or, you know, an animation program. And it's just about trying to use it to communicate with the other people around you to be like, is this a good idea? Back to the T's though, I think that they're, you know, I don't want to like, you know, talk about it too much, but like, I think it's what I would do. The reason I would draw them out is because we'd be talking about like, what does it look like to be a designer? What's it look like to be a senior designer? What's it look like to be a creative lead? Like, what shape T do you have to be that person? And it's like, it's a really honest way to talk to somebody about their skill set and what they need to do to move from one side to the other. Because the one thing is now is like everybody wants to be a director. I mean, like I'm the oldest millennial. Okay, like I was born in 1981, and Wikipedia says I'm a millennial. And I definitely look back in my career, and there was definitely moments. Every single stop I was at, I thought I was a level higher. So that's a, you know, definitely like a millennial attitude. But like, you know, everybody comes into a job now, and they I remember I had a person that worked for me at my last studio, the last studio I was at. I was giving her a review, and I was telling her, I'm like, you're a creative lead. Like, this is your position. She was hired as an art director, and I really don't even know what that means because, you know, to me, like we were designing things. So I was like, you're a design lead. Like, that's what you are. You're a design lead. You lead design. And she was like, yeah, but I really wanted the art director title because I wanted director in my title. And I was like, that's like irrelevant. Like, it has nothing to do with you actually doing. But like, when you sit down and you draw out the T's and you're like, this is where you're at, and these are the skills you need to get to the next stop, I think it's super helpful because it also helps people realize they don't have to be good at everything. Because if you like, that's not T-shaped.
Yeah.
Good at everything is square-shaped.
Yeah.
Or a circle. I don't know what it is, but it's not T.
Yeah. You know? Well, it'd be like a teeter-totter, right? Because you won't have enough depth here, and it's just always going to be off balance.
Totally.
Yeah, so good. Yeah. And I think I like the language you're using for it because sometimes the pushback that this topic gets, you know, I mean, this is kind of my jam, right? Like talking about this transdisciplinary and all the blur and everything. And there's some people that love that. And there's some people that are kind of turned off by it. And, you know, we've even had guests on the show before that kind of actually are like, well, you know, yeah, that's interesting stuff, but I want to talk about like, let's not lose the purity of my craft, right? And I respect that for the purposes of that T. But I think it's really good to honor the fact that, like, yeah, you don't necessarily need to even want to be good at everything.
Yeah.
Like, build a niche for yourself, but be open to being influenced, you know?
Everybody's different, man. I graduated with some people who are phenomenal industrial designers, better than I'll ever be, and they deserve to be in the creative world. We need them, you know? So it's different horses for different courses, you know, like there's no one type of designer that's better than another. We're all necessary, especially depending on where you end up in life, where you work. But yeah, I find this conversation to be quite divisive. You know, I worked at a place that like was the design thinking company, you know, and I mean, the one thing I love about IDEO is that they never really like trademarked design thinking. They let anyone do it because anyone can do it. I've worked at other companies that like have to trademark their process, and it's like, come on, like we're not the experts at this. Right. Everybody can do it. But I think what's kind of funny is like with design thinking or even like transdisciplinary or, you know, I'm this discipline, it's so like black and white. And it's like, the truth is you are better at, there's one thing you're probably great at. And for me, like I'm an industrial designer. I'm an industrial designer that happens to also sometimes design interfaces, sometimes design services. I usually do it with people who are also amazing at that. So, but I'm still an industrial designer, but like the whole design thinking conversation is like on the other side of that is you have like, well, I'm a design doer. And it's just such a, like, to me, it's like, it couldn't be more political. On one side, you have like these, you know, design lefties who are like, it's thinking. And on the other side, you have these, you know, like design conservatives are like, nope, it's about doing. If you're thinking, that's wrong. It's like, Guys, the word design is about thinking and doing. Design is about making decisions. The more decisions you can make, the more design you're doing.
Yeah.
This conversation is not helpful.
Right. Amen, dude. We need to bring you in to moderate some of those conversations. That's so
Yeah,
good.
I have before. It's called being an internet troll.
Ah, touche. There you go. Yeah. So, well, I mean, I think it leads into even talking about, you mentioned this interesting intersection between design and advertising. So, I mean, that intrigues me because now we're not just talking about across disciplines within design, but now, bleeding over into categories even. To me, it's a natural fit because you're talking about designed things that you are trying to get humans to want, right? Like if the psychology's still there, all of that still fits, but it had to be a bit of an abrupt kind of shock to the system to go from all of these process-based places that use similar processes but brag about it, and you're around other creatives, and then now
Yeah.
all of a sudden you got to speak a new language and kind of pick up a new set of tricks. What would that look like?
I mean, just to be like clear, like people have been doing design and advertising since forever, right? Like, I'm in Connecticut now. I live about, 10 minutes away from, the Philip Johnson Glass House and Elliot Noy's old house. And so, I mean, Elliot Noy's, like, he's an architect. He designed products. He designed experiences. He designed brand systems. He designed advertising. Like, he did everything. They did, and that's what those places did. There was, every single design studio in that time did everything. And so it's not a new thing. It's happened before. It happens still now. But I think, to me, like, the allure of it was, when I was working at IDEO the first time, this realization that we were doing all these things. And I think as a creative person, I think that, no matter what kind of designer you are, I think good designers are good communicators. And that means you're probably a good writer. You might not be a great speaker, but you should be able to write well if you're a good designer. And so for me, like, we'd be working on these projects at IDEO, and yeah, there'd be a physical product component or a packaging component to it. There might be some sort of like interface or digital component, but there's always also kind of like a brand component to it. And I always loved writing things. Occasionally I would draw something that looked like it might be a good logo, but like I was always kind of playing in these different areas, and I was doing it with people who were no slouches at that discipline. And that only like bred confidence, but also gave me, like, I watched other people do it. So I picked up their moves. And I mean, that's kind of one of the most important parts of being a designer, is mimicking. I mean, you don't want to steal, and you want to kind of create your own style, but like seeing someone else do something and then trying it out for yourself and then trying it out again your way, I think is a really important thing. And so I was just collecting all of these things. And I mean, like I said before, the details that make me most excited and keep me engaged the longest are details related to a physical thing. But I love to write copy. I love to, like, I just did this project, I'm working on this project right now with this huge dog food company, and we're like working on, so the whole project's about how do we make pet parents more proactive in their pets' health. So there's digital concepts, physical concepts, but like I wrote this manifesto and poem because we just want, it's like part of the concept, like the physicality of the concept, part of the digital experience of the concept, kind of wrote on what we were calling it, the name, and we wanted to substantiate that. And so I just kind of collected all of these skills, and I like to use them. Now, I think the other side of that is like the reality of like working in an advertising environment as a product designer, whether you're digital or physical, it doesn't matter. I think it's just a totally different beast. And so sometimes the reality isn't as great as the fantasy.
Sure. No, that makes sense. Yeah, the end product that you're delivering on and what you're ultimately being paid for is different. And, that's the master you're serving, kind of, right? So I think, it's going to change where your work is prioritized or what's valued. And that makes total sense. Yeah. So then was there anything about that that spun you off to go towards, the .org and social impact design? Was that related, or did it just happen to be another great opportunity?
My career is just like, like falling upstairs. It was just a great opportunity. And I think it's, in a lot of ways, I think like co-op at Cincinnati ruined me, because you just like move on to awesome place after awesome place. And if you don't like it, you just move on. And so that kind of carried over into my career a little bit. Like I'm always hungry for the next thing, which I guess is great that now I have my own studio, because that's the whole point, is like you're supposed to go get more business.
Yeah.
But yeah, going to .org, that was just a moment where honestly, like I worked at Code and Theory and built a cool team there and done some really cool work. Accidentally done some work in social impact. And then I moved on to a place called Co-Collective, and we were doing some cool work. It was more in the brand strategy area. And I was just a little burnt out on agency life in general, whether it was, it didn't matter what kind of agency. And I just knew at that point, I was like, I'm either going to go back to, like, I was thinking about going on my own at that time, or going back to a place where I thought that people understood me, going back to an IDEO or a Frog or something. And it just so happened a former colleague of mine at IDEO like reached out, and he's like, hey man, and this was like, I hadn't talked to this person in a long time. He was like, .org's looking for a design director. Would you be interested? I could connect you with the founder of .org. And I was like, sure. And at the time I was pursuing a bunch of different angles. And like every time I'd come back from an interview, my wife would ask me like, well, how is it with .org? And I was like, I'm interested. It was like one of those things where I wasn't like hyped. I wasn't like this, because it was kind of like the dark horse. But every time I went in to talk, it was like, oh, that's kind of cool. That's pretty interesting. And because I had no intention of ever going back to IDEO. It's a place that made me who I am, but I just kind of felt like I was supposed to pursue other horizons. And I never thought I would work, in a fully social impact capacity. But the more I interviewed there, the more I realized this was an amazing design challenge, because number one, there's this like total misnomer that when you work in social impact, that good enough is good enough, like, oh, these people, they're in a challenging situation. It's okay if it's only okay. The truth is, the challenges that people face, like, are of the greatest severity. And so you have to match that with the greatest level of design. Like, it can't be okay. It has to be the best.
Yeah.
So in that way, I was like, wow, that's an amazing challenge to solve a systemic problem and do it in a way that like in the same way I would design like a consumer electronic device that's going to be awesome at CES. It's like that same level of design amazingness. Of course it has to be in this moment. But so it was, and then it was just when I went back, it was like coming home, because now all of the culture and the values kind of aligned with in the ways of working and the ways of talking to each other. Were so familiar and felt like home. But going into a place where like I was not an expert on social impact. Unless your screen's broken, like I am a bald white man, okay, as much privilege as there comes. And so it was like, while it was like coming home, it was like going to the moon. So it just, that entire experience of working at .org was like a creative education like none other. And luckily we got to do some cool work at the same time.
Yeah. That concept of excellence, now, that's something you obviously adopted and maybe even brought in with you. Was that a cultural thing that sort of you knew even coming in, like, hey, this is not just, oh, this is the nonprofit arm and this is sort of where the subpar work gets done?
No. So like I knew that the work, the rigor of the work, the intention of the work was of the highest level. And I mean, I think going into it, you scan .org's portfolio of projects, and it was all awesome. But then, through the interview process, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I was excited to go back. It's like Jocelyn Wyatt, the founder of .org, she started at IDEO like a year after I did the first time. And so I didn't know much about her. I just knew that she came from, she's kind of like a sustainability and social impact expert. I know she came from that space. But then her co-founder was a woman named Patrice Martin, who is of an industrial design persuasion. She was a researcher at IDEO for a period of time. And so she was kind of just this awesome, again, like multidisciplinary creative person who, I hadn't worked with, but she'd worked in the Chicago office a few different times. And so I kind of knew her and what she was about. And then the person who would become my boss at .org, Adam Reinick, he was an industrial designer at IDEO in Palo Alto when I was there. And he's one of these guys who's just, he's expanded his career in the things he works on, but at his heart, he is an industrial designer who cares about the details of design. So there were these people involved at the top of the organization that just made me know that like I was going into a special place that wanted design at a level of the problems they were solving. And then when you meet the team was just, they're all amazing people. And so, that's kind of what led me to wholeheartedly go into that new adventure.
Yeah, I love that, man. I worked for some nonprofits for a while at one stop in my career. And I think that was actually maybe one of the most disheartening things about it was that, nonprofits and that type of work tend to draw people who are usually really passionate about the cause. But unfortunately, I kept running into a lot of people who their passion for the cause was there, but somehow it didn't translate over into doing it with excellence. It was just
Yeah.
this perpetual bleeding heart. And I look at things like what IDEO.org does and the story that people like you were telling, I'm like, that re-inspires me to still want to be in that space because not everybody sees it as good enough is good enough.
Yeah. Well, I think a couple things work in .org's favor. Number one is like the association with IDEO. .org is a completely separate business entity. It's a nonprofit. But it is, like in New York, the studios share a space. So IDEO and IDEO.org share a space in New York. They used to share a space in San Francisco, and then .org got big enough that it moved across the street on the Embarcadero. But it has that lineage. And .org shares, or IDEO shares people with .org, and .org sometimes shares people with IDEO depending on the project. But there is that like culture. So that's one thing that helps them. But I would also just say the people who are leading .org are awesome. Like Jocelyn Wyatt is a force of nature. She makes that place successful, even against its own will, because .org faces the same problems that everyone else does in the social impact space, which is the work is really hard. And sometimes it's almost impossible to solve in the course of a project. And so in that way, like the challenge of the work can be very sad. If you're working on a sexual reproductive health project in West Africa, that's probably one of the hardest projects you're going to work on because of the things that occur, the barriers that are put in front of people and their health and their lives that are kind of altered in the course of that. So the content of the projects are hard, and then to make an impact because of like the bureaucratic stuff is even harder. And then you're like, and make it pretty. It's just,
Right.
As a designer, you're just like in the corner, you're like the world. It's like, seriously, like because of they run up against the same challenges, but because of the association with IDEO and the relationship, and because of the leadership, I think there is this expectation that the work has to still be awesome. And I think that's exactly how it's supposed to be. And like the coolest part was when I was at IDEO, when I went back to .org, you heard people like Tim Brown or Paul Bennett or Sandy Spiker. You heard these leaders inside IDEO talk about the goals of IDEO. And it was like everything they talked about being a positive change in the world is like, well, that's 100% what .org is doing. And so it just felt like a really awesome place to be. Everybody who's watching this is probably like, why did you stop working there? And it's like, it's really hard to read bedtime stories from Nairobi. That would be my answer.
That's fair. Yeah. Well, I think you talk about something interesting too, of the idea of like, well, if you're going to be doing really great human-centric design, like you've got to get in the mess and the weeds of, fall in love with the problem and be empathetic. And it's one thing to do that for, I want to really get in the space of this pet parent that wants the best for their, dog or cat, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can put that aside. But if you're going to go down the rabbit hole of, like you just described, a challenge that those folks are facing, like you can't, I don't know how you turn that off and how that doesn't affect you. There is probably something to be said for you can do that for a period and then you have to kind of recharge even, you know?
Yeah, I think there are so many times where I miss working at .org, and we have, this is one of the cool parts about it, is we have Ideo.org alumni Zoom calls, and so you're still connected to the company, you're still connected to the culture. I still text with these folks, and so I miss it a lot, but I still feel like I'm a .orger. But I think one of the things I would add about the experience working there, just kind of the conversation about the quality of work, was, I mean, what I came back, and one of the reasons I came back and people were excited for me to come back was because of my experience at IDEO. So they were getting a person that understood the culture. And in New York, it was kind of important because the office had just started in New York. And so there needed to be like this normalization of like the IDEO culture and the .org culture. And it was nice to have somebody on the leadership team in New York that understood, that had some, like, there was like one meeting, there's like an office meeting where like Tim Brown was talking, and he was like, Geoff, you might remember when this happened. He was like telling a story, and I was like, it's like, oh my God, Tim Brown. Like everybody,
Right.
like that was street,
called me out. Yeah.
yeah, it was street cred for me. It was like, I'm like the most nobody at IDEO. Like I know that IDEO has C teams because I was on the C team back in the day. But like that was a moment where I was kind of like, oh yeah, I got a little shine from Tim. But one of the things that struck me was like, I thought I knew how to do my job. I thought I knew how to do design research. I thought I knew how to build empathy. I thought I knew how to do synthesis. And then I went to .org, and it was a whole new beast. Because like, just one story, for instance, like typically when I started IDEO, it's like you go do research for 2 weeks. You go do research in one location 1 week, come home, do research in another city another week, come home, go back to your cushy studio and space and like do synthesis for a couple weeks and eat M&Ms. And .org, it was like, cool, so you're going to go to another country right now, or even like I worked on domestic projects, you're going to go to Brownsville, Texas right now, and you're not going to come home. Like, especially if you're going to Nairobi, like you're going there for a month, you're not coming home, you're going to do research, you're going to live down the street from the problem. Your kitchen in the place that you're renting is going to turn into your Post-it note covered studio space. You're going to eat, sleep, and breathe this problem, whether you care to or not. And when you have an idea, you can walk down the street and prototype it. And when you build prototypes, you can leave them with people who are dealing with this challenge. And that was like next level, human-centered design. And we had people who would come from IDEO to like do like a 6-9 month rotation at .org, and they would come back to IDEO and they'd give presentations to their colleagues and being like, we think that we prototype, but those guys, they really prototype. And so those experiences informed like a lot of the stuff I'm doing right now. Like I believe very deeply, you have to like design with people and not for people, and you have to design it where it's going to be made. If you can do that, you can't do the whole project in that place, but if you can design something where it's going to be made, you instantly imbue your solution with an empathy you would never have just reading stuff on the internet or working in your studio. Mm-hmm. So .org was an incredible experience.
Yeah, you're hitting on stuff that it's hard that I'm trying to adapt to with how I even teach this type of stuff for students, right? Because my process with teaching innovation classes always involved front end. You do some landscape research from your desk, but then we're going to jump right into like getting into and talking to the people and immersing yourself and doing ethnographic observations and all these things. That's a lot harder to do in the current environment we're in. I can't in good faith send a student or a group of students in to go like, yeah, go immerse yourself in this challenge with a bunch of people that you probably should be distanced from and wearing masks with even each other, right? I'm still trying to figure that one out, and I'm hoping that we find a way past this to where we don't lose that skill set or momentum, but also that we're not ever able to get it back, for instance, right? Because that's such an important part of it.
Yeah, I think that and I don't know, I think I find this to be similar as like when CAD, like 3D CAD and rendering got really, really good in like the last like 10 years, where people like there are designers that don't make physical prototypes, like they just do the rendering and here you go, this is what it's going to look like. I would compare this situation that we were in to that, because in that sense, there was a moment where technology allowed industrial designers or other designers to design things that looked like they were real, even though they may not have been fully investigated from a functional standpoint yet. And anyone that doesn't make prototypes is only doing design wrong now. Even if you jump into CAD from day one and you can make a photorealistic rendering by that evening, you still need to be making prototypes. You need to like be cutting foam core, cutting foam, building stuff, mocking it up to prove it to yourself. And I think the same thing's going to happen with this kind of like Zoom economy that we live in now, where like, yeah, we're realizing we can do a lot from our homes, from our desks, from wherever, as long as we have the internet and the cloud. But, you know, I think right now from like an insight and an empathy perspective, you know, we're doing the best we can with you know, like every project I've been doing lately, we've been doing ethnography over a Google Hangout or something, and we're doing the best that we can. We're having people walk around their homes with their phone and show us stuff. But I don't, just like there's something about like the first time you pick something up, like that's when you fall in love with your idea. I drew it, I rendered it. That first minute I pick it up and I'm like, I love that detail. That's never going to end. That's like caveman stuff. I love it. It's never going to end. And I think as from an insight perspective and an empathy perspective, yeah, man, I can connect with you online. We can talk. You can show me your life. We can have interesting conversations, but there's never going to be a replacement for the moment you're in a place and you recognize a problem, or the way someone's voice sounds in a room when they tell you their hardest experience, or the way a place smells when you are discovering the complexity of a challenge. I think that's never going to end. And I think, you know, we'll get back to it. I just think we just can't forget that those things are super important.
Yeah, and it's almost, I feel like this responsibility is sort of like a steward of that, to remind people sometimes, you know, like, yes, we're accomplishing quite a bit and we're learning new ways to do all of these things, but like there's some of us who almost have to be the responsible stewards of like reminding, once we're able to really fully re-engage, like we're gonna have to push hard on reminding why that was important, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would also fall back on just like kind of the fun part, and it makes me cringe to even say this, but like one of the reasons I really got into, I'm a pretty social person, but I actually didn't really like doing design research and ethnographies at first. I'm kind of okay at them because, you know, I'm good at chatting with folks and noticing things, but it's tough to put yourself out there. And I remember when I first started to get into it, I got really into it because I would sit down at the beginning of a project with my teammates. And I mean, after we came up with a funny name for the project, then we talk about like, well, where should we get inspired from? And that was always such a fun activity of like to go on the dog thing again. I remember I was doing a dog project at Ideoorg like, you know, 15 years ago. And we were like, we have to talk to a Hollywood animal trainer. It was about healthy dog treats. And so like through the network of our team, we found a Hollywood animal trainer and we went and saw this guy and met his contact monkeys. Those are monkeys that you can hold because they like, that's their like their special power is like contact monkeys won't tear your face off. The monkeys that can juggle, they'll totally murder you. We met this rhino. Every time we tried to leave, he's like, don't you feed my elephants? Don't you want to see my giraffe? Don't you want to see my lion? I thought he was going to have an alien. Right. It was crazy. So, but like, I loved it. We got so many good insights from talking to him, but then it was just this amazing experience. Yeah. And I think even that, it's like, if for nothing else, it's like, we will go back to doing research in person and being inspired by real places and actual people, because it's a great story and it's a great experience for us, because that's a thing that, I mean, I tell that dog story on so many projects. Yeah. And it's a thing that I can't like, you know, it's hard to buy.
Yeah. Well, and I honestly believe, wholeheartedly believe that stuff makes its way, you know, it sneaks into the DNA of something, any creative project, right? Even if it's not, you can't even draw, like there's some things where you can very clearly show like, here was the inspiration and here's what happened. But you got to know that like that experience you all had there's things about that found their way into the DNA of the project, and that stuff, without that, creative work could get real sterile, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you take a partner, a client or a partner with you on those experiences. Obviously, you can't take everybody to these moments because you don't want to overwhelm your respondents, but you take your partners with you, and they may only go to 1 or 2 interviews, but they'll hear something and believe it. Your partner, your client will repeat that person's quote over and over through the project. It will become that person, and that 10 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever you spend with them, we become the reason that you make design decisions or things happen internally at their organization, because they were affected by actually seeing and feeling and building empathy for the problem that you're solving.
Yeah, so good. This is so good, man. I feel like we've covered so many things. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you wanted to talk about?
I don't know, man. I got no agenda. So no, I feel like, we've been across it all.
Yeah.
And yet it feels like we haven't covered enough.
Yeah, we kind of covered your story arc, and we hit all the high points. I think that's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty good, man. It's pretty good.
Yeah, this has been so fun. Really appreciate it. I'm glad that Jamie connected us, and I love your story. I mean, it helps. I think we're somewhat on the same page about a lot of things, but you're bringing color to things that were just sort of outlines for me before. Like, you're filling in the gaps. So I love it. Well, thanks for your time. Thanks for joining us. And I guess the last thing I would wonder is, do you have any parting words of wisdom for, I'm talking to these 19 to 22-year-old creatives that have the world ahead of them, and a lot
Yeah.
of them want to be in these spaces. Like, anything you would pass on to them of, like, how do you build that resiliency? How do you keep confidence in it? How do you stay inspired? How do you
Yeah.
make your tea,
I mean, the one thing I would say is, there's a couple things. Number one is, like, you're supposed to suck. Like, I think that that's like one of my favorite things to tell young designers that I work with, or that I'm responsible for supporting, is you're supposed to suck. Just suck Monday through Thursday. Do not wait till Friday to be terrible. And I mean, that's a thing that, like, there's a preciousness that designers can have. Like, I don't want to share it till it's perfect. And especially as a young designer. And I think the truth is, it's like, like I was saying to you before, you get hired for your potential, but it takes, I believe deeply in that, like, 10,000 hours thing. It takes you like 3 or 4 years to get good or okay at being whatever discipline you are. So be cool with the fact that somebody hired you because your portfolio was better than theirs when they were starting in your position, or that there's this thing that's intangible about you that they just have to have it on their team. Be okay with the fact that you got hired for potential, and every single day work on building experience, and you don't do it in a vacuum. So it's okay to be bad. You're supposed to be bad. The other people around you will not let you be bad at the end of the project if you are communicating with them the entire time. So, I mean, and it's hard for some people to do that because you have to be vulnerable. So I think that's my number one thing I would share with young people. It's just, it's okay to suck, and just, you got to work at it every single day.
Yeah, right on. There it is. It's okay to suck. That'll be our closing line here.
Yeah,
Right
exactly.
on. Cool. Well, hey, Geoff, thanks so much for your time, man. This has been great. And I would love to stay in touch about other projects, and, pick your brain on some of these classes that I'm teaching that fit with that. So if you don't mind, I'll hit you up.
Definitely. This was really fun, Aaron. I'm really glad we got put in touch, and I'm happy to chat with you, whether it's being recorded or not, about all things design, man.
Right on, dude. I don't have contact monkeys. I mean, I have a 5-year-old that shows
Yeah.
up and does funny things sometimes, but
I have a 5-year-old too, and he is totally a contact monkey.
right on. All right, cool. Well, thank you. And hey, thanks to everybody who tuned in today. And, obviously you might be checking this out online. We appreciate you continuing to check out the show and hear these stories. We'd love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out on any of the social media channels. Let us know if there's topics you want us to talk about. And obviously, as always, a huge thank you to Cincinnati Bell for sponsoring and making these conversations possible, and making this format possible. So we'll look forward to seeing you next time. And yeah, stay safe out there, and tune in for our next episode. Thanks.